Thank you. Thank you for the intro. That's hard to follow, but welcome. Today's topic is actually modernizing identity and protection practices. One of my charges, and it says JJ Consultant, I'm actually working independently now, but one of my charges at previous insurers like MetLife was really about how to accelerate the direct-to-consumer business, but also meet customers where they were. And so identity always came up. How do you get the data? How do you validate who you're speaking to? And so this continues to be a space that we need to explore, especially as innovation moves closer and closer to taking their products and services online. So today, I'm very happy to have Ben Agner from UNUM and Marianne Miller from Probe join me for today's fireside chat. So thank you, Marianne and Ben, for joining. Yep. I'm going to steal some of Jeff's thunder from earlier. So Marianne and Ben, if you will give us your introductions, tell us where you are and what you do relevant to your current companies, and then let's talk about what modernizing identity actually means to you. So Marianne, you want to kick us off?
Great. It's great to be here with everyone today. I'm Marianne Miller. I'm the Vice President of Client Experience, but I'm also a fraud and cybercrime executive advisor. I've spent just a really exciting career working globally in identity authentication and fraud, splitting my time in leadership roles with technology companies, fintechs, and banking. For example, I was a head of fraud for Lloyds Banking Group in London, worked for PayPal, USAA, and just to name a few. Most recently, I worked for a fintech that received its national charter, Varo Bank, and it's great to be here to talk about my favorite subject, identity.
Thank you, Marianne. Ben?
Yeah, and I'm Ben Agner. I'm as close as you can get to being a Charlotte native, at least. I grew up in Cherryville, North Carolina, about 45 minutes from here, and I've been in Charlotte proper for about 10 years now. Been in tech kind of my whole life, my whole career. Really moved into cybersecurity and the insurance space with an insurtech startup here in Charlotte called Empowered Benefits. They got acquired by Aflac and then brought me on shortly after they were acquired by Aflac. They were doing the enrollment platform and watched them scale from, gosh, I think 500,000 in revenue to like 1.5 billion under Aflac's direction and leadership, and then moved into Aflac, started doing really all of their subsidiary work, and then it rolled into M&A and that sort of stuff, and then most recently I'm now Deputy CISO at UNUM, which is Fortune 250 insurance, Colonial Life, Starmount, that sort of stuff. So.
Well, thank you. Again, thanks for joining us. So every time we turn on the TV and radio, we're hearing about these threats, right? Data breaches, we can't get away from it. So what are some of the indicators, what are some of the trends that you're seeing in the market that are really standing out to you? And Ben, I'll start with you.
Well, the huge thing's ransomware, right? And the thing that's happening is that this ransomware is coming in because of users getting their identities compromised, essentially. I mean, like something like 70% of our ransomware attacks are happening because of a user using improper credentials, somebody stealing it through a phish, things like that. And it's really just, I mean, everybody's seen the headlines, it's just rampant nowadays. And it's extremely difficult, and there's a lot of focus on protecting against that right now.
What about you, Marianne?
Jenny, this is my favorite,
you get excited.
my favorite question, so I can talk all day about this, but I'll try to keep it as brief as possible. The threats are real. If we take a look at the pandemic, and most recently the Department of Labor quoted that 1.86 billion is the estimate of money that was lost to fraud, and this is related to digital identity proofing, with the origination of the PPP loans and the unemployment insurance loans. That's taxpayer money. That's all of our money here. We heard an announcement by Twitter that 4.5 million accounts were fake accounts. And all of us in this room probably are keeping up with the Elon Musk buying, PayPal announced the 4.5 million fake accounts, which actually affected the stock price for a moment. And then, of course, we all know the Elon's discussion about, how many accounts are real on the Twitter platform. I firsthand experienced that digital attack rate during the pandemic, leading a fraud for a newly chartered bank in a all digital environment. And really what's broken out there is there's lots of systems that can tell you this is Mary Ann's name, this is her social, this is her date of birth and her address, but they don't, many institutions, many banking, fintechs don't have the tools in place today that identifies that Mary Ann's presenting that information in the flow. So therefore, the bad actors are ramping up with their synthetics, their identity theft of you and I and our account information. If today, and I'll leave one more question in your mind about the attack rate. If a bad actor opens up, for example, a credit card account in your name, you can see that inquiry at the bureau, and you can also see that trade line open at the bureau. So we can call Experian or Equifax, we can call that company and have that credit card shut down. If a bad actor opens up a DDA account in our name or a fintech account in our name, there's nowhere for us as American citizens to go and find out that that account was opened up in our name. And that account's being used for money laundering, that account's being used for check fraud, that account's being used for ACH fraud, and the list goes on and on. So there really is consequences to individuals. I say Americans are committing crimes they don't know about, and it really shows the challenge for us to really, and again, we can talk as the conversation goes on, how we can lean on tech to start to solve some of these problems.
Yes, and so I like that term, bad actors. I'm gonna have to remember that. I'm gonna cover it. So you talk about the pandemic and social media, right? So these are new impacts. In the past, we dealt with personal data, we dealt with health data. Now we're talking about social data, right? Mm-hmm. So the question is, what are the impacts of these type of identity exposures? And Mary Ann, you got into that a little bit, but what does that really mean for the future of identity?
Yeah, and do you want me to go first?
Yes.
It's really interesting. So we look at the social impacts of, and let's just start with social media as part of it playing a part in social impacts. And Ben probably could attest to this, but we talk about the dark web. So the dark web is usually something where the bad actors reside and they share information. Well, the dark web is no longer dark. If you go out on Telegram today, right now, you can find multiple channels right now dedicated to fraud. And these are fraud actors sharing the fraud Bibles, how to, fraud as a service. They're sharing information. Most recent information, I can share one that's very active right now, where insiders at telcos right now are being paid up to $3,000 at AT&T or at T-Mobile to SIM swap your phone to attack your bank account, to take control over the one-time password. So we have the whole social media dynamics that play a part in all of the attacks that we're seeing that really affect us keeping our platform safe. Yeah.
Yep. And Ben, what does that mean for you in terms of new type of exposures in the future of identity?
Well, really, the big thing with COVID, right, is there's no longer face-to-face interactions. Insurance has always been a face-to-face business, right? You file a claim, your agent's there. You enroll, your agent's there, right? And so the identity was always kind of assumed to be confirmed by the agent, and for the most part it was, excluding some fraudulent agents that we've experienced. But for the most part, right, like you trust your agents, you trust the people that they're enrolling, the people that they say they're enrolling. And then you move to COVID and it's like, oh, well, now we're doing Zoom enrollments. Now I don't have that physical face-to-face. The agent assist experience has changed a lot, right? And so how do you know that person was actually that person at the point in time in which it was enrolled, or how do you know that person is that person at the point in which you're filing a claim, too, right? Because we just can't send people, or we weren't able to send people for a long time to go validate some of these claims that were happening. So, how do you validate at the point in time of that claim that the identity, that person is who they say they actually are, and it's not someone fraudulently claiming to be that person because of some compromised credentials on the internet,
Yeah. And you brought up a good point. There are people that are digitally native. They want to do business online. They don't want the intermediary, right? They don't want the broker anymore. But I heard you mention, you talked a little bit about insurance, right? Which is why we're here today. So all entities in the public and private sector are affected by this digital insecurity. In addition to customers, and Ben, I'm going to start with you. Who else are the key players at the table?
I mean, there's, when you're talking insurance, there's a few different ways that you're dealing with identity, right? You've got your customer identity, you've got your broker and your agent identity, you have your HR admin or your customer identity, right? And then you have kind of your internal identity of your employees, right? And all of those really have to be handled in a completely separate method, right? Like how I'm going to validate the identity of a customer is very different from how I'm going to validate the identity of one of my internal users. And then you've got a whole separate issue with your brokers, where your brokers and agents are dealing with 15, 20 different companies, and they have a separate identity for each of these 15 and 20 different companies. They have to do enrollments, they have to do assisted enrollments, they have to share physical devices as they're doing enrollments, if they're doing face-to-face enrollments, and all of those make for a very, very complicated user experience to get right, to get it to a way that they want to use your platform to enroll. And honestly, there's a few gaps there in the industry that I wish kind of the industry would come together and say, brokers and agents, we're all dealing with the same ones. Why are we maintaining 18 different broker and agent identity solutions? Why can't we have a singular one that we all federate to and work with, But yeah, I'll get off my soapbox.
Sure, soapbox.
Yeah.
Marianne, is there anybody else at the table we should be thinking about, other stakeholders?
Yeah, I really like what Ben just said, and I think, if whether we're talking about insurance or healthcare or banking or financial services, we all are dealing with the same types of issues, and there's technology and there's ways that we can lean on different ways to identity proof. And I heard in the session before it takes 4 hours to get an auto loan, and yet I just heard a quote the other day in one jurisdiction here in the U.S. 1 out of 3 loans are fraud. So, and part of that is the challenges of the digital identity proofing. So, interactions starting to modernize, and customer experiences starting to modernize, but yet bad actors are also modernizing. Yeah. It's going to take us all, I think, collaboration and discussion forums like we are here today, discussing these topics so that we can start work on the best technologies to take us forward.
Absolutely. So let's talk.
I will do one quick on that. It's funny when we talk about modernizing the digital experience and stuff like that, especially around like car auto quotes and stuff like that, right? The NYDFS released an alert, it's probably 6-7 months ago, right, where in order to make it easier and quicker for the user, the quote tools were kind of looking up information from external sources, right? Because I can pay for a service that says Ben Agner, my social, my address. These are my policies. These are my cars. These are my beneficiaries, and the quoting tools weren't doing a good enough job validating who that user was, and attackers were repeatedly over and over again stuffing legitimate credential information that's just unfortunately been put on the internet. And now we've got this huge problem of people getting additional information because we as insurance providers are handing it to users to make their digital experience better. Sure. But we're unfortunately not doing a good enough job of validating their identity before we give them that information back.
That's right.
So attackers are exploiting it.
That's right, they are.
So let's talk about the opportunity space. We always, again, say that insurance is slowly moving products and services online, right? I think it's the running joke in the room. We heard it in the previous session. I read a stat that said insurtech is obviously on the rise. They're seeing a $3.8 billion increase in investments in 2020 in insurtech alone. So what are the new problems presenting themselves for stakeholders to solve? We talked about that a little bit, but specifically, what are the right solutions, right? They're not in place today. Some of them may be, right, or they may need to evolve. But what are these solutions, and how can the insurance industry keep pace while protecting its customers? And so, Marianne, I'll throw that to you.
Yeah, so there's, if we think about the topic of digital identity proofing, to Ben's point, get the information, understand who's in the flow digitally, who's applying for this claim, or who's applying for this bank account, or who's applying for this auto loan. If you start to look at the whole, what's really interesting is classically, the teams behind the scenes were, okay, we're validating Marianne's information, but we're not validating that she's presenting it. So some of the solutions, for example, some companies are moving towards taking a picture front and back of your driver's license and comparing it to a selfie. So that's one way to kind of look at, okay, I'm in possession of my driver's license, there's a selfie of me and it matches the driver's license. There's also solutions like we have at Prove, where you're looking at and you're correlating the trust of the phone. So everyone has a phone with them. Mm-hmm. And you can start to look at encrypted data. You can also look at data that you can prove that Marianne's actually on her phone in the flow, and that is Marianne, and validating Marianne's identity information, the trust of her phone. Does it make phone calls? Is it trustworthy on the network? And then also identity verify using trustworthy data from like the bureaus to correlate all of that. So when you start to look at your digital experiences, and I think once you decide to launch a new product, is digital identity proofing has to be part of that plan and part of that build, and not an afterthought. Right. I've been talking to some banks today that are pausing their digital identity onboarding processes because their attack rates are so high that they have to pause it, put in some new fraud solutions until they can get a grip, because of the attack rate's so high. So I think that if you're really looking at your cadence of your product build, is to really look at those really modern technologies that are out there that can start to tell you that's Marianne in the flow.
While they build.
Okay.
Yeah. What are you seeing on your side, Ben?
Yeah, well, I just noticed, I'm Ben Agner, by the way, we're not married.
Oh, yeah. That's right.
If anybody's trying to find me on LinkedIn, you're gonna have a hard time if you're looking for Miller. But no, the thing is, and insurance is a little bit different than banking, right? Because our fraud is typically a day two fraud versus banking. You kind of have to do the identity proofing before you can even give them an account, because then the fraud will happen almost immediately. Usually our fraud is claims fraud, and so we already have established the relationship with the user, and so we have the ability to do a little bit more identity proofing kind of ahead of time rather than at the point of account creation, right? But to your point, right, we need better context when we're talking about identity proofing. Like it is not sufficient for me to say, I know your email address and your social security number and your password, and you are you, and we're good, right? Now I'm gonna send your two-factor code to your email address, that using a password that you've had for 10 years for that same email address, right? And so it's really about bringing in that context, and mobile devices is one of those contexts. Is the physical device is something that you can know, right? Once you register that person, you can register their device as part of it. I'm sure you guys do something similar to that, right? But that's kind of some of the context you need to do to prevent that fraud and to prevent that abuse. Is people don't really change devices very frequently, right? They're going to be logging in from their cell phone. They're going to be logging in from their work computer. They're going to be logging in from their personal computer. That's about it, right? Like nobody's logging in from a terminal on a boat, to get to their insurance information. So, taking that context of is this an IP that they've come from before? Is this a device that they've come from before? Is this the first time I'm seeing something? Did they log in from Seattle and then log in from New York 15 minutes later, right? Are they using, a virtual machine? There's plenty of stuff you can do without actually without the user knowing that that's happening, right? And y'all are all familiar with it, right? You've seen the "I trust this device" checkbox, right? there's a lot of different ways for that I trust this device checkbox to work, and there are some really bad ones, and then there are some really amazing ones. And I've seen some really interesting stuff come out in the past year or two around that kind of tying that device to that user. It sounds like you guys can do it, kind of without context to begin with. I can say, this is the person, is their device, instead of me having to figure out if that's their device or not.
Yeah, that's right. We can do that, just by the fact that we know that the user is actually connected to the cell phone tower, if you want to think about it through the SIM card. So it's very easy to tell, yeah, this is live and this is actually Mary Ann on her phone in the flow, whether it's an initial onboarding or whether it's later for calling and servicing her account. We know that's Mary Ann.
Yeah. So you guys both talked about solutions, right? Industry responses, things that are happening now. Big question. What can companies do to create digital trust? What else do we need to do as organizations and companies to create that space? Mary Ann, I'll start with you.
I say prioritize it. So here's, I've come out more recently and I've watched the industry, and often when there are new companies trying to get traction in the digital space, growth. It's all about growth. It's all about investor relations. But I think what we have to do is take a step back, and we have to say safe growth, and verified users, and be able to know who our customer is from the beginning. Because whether you do that, you're going to pay the price later to take that bad actor or pay for that fraud. And so I think that really looking at how we can upfront really establish that trust, because of the fact that if your customer's first experience with you is fraud, or first experience with you is identity theft, or you fix your reputation, that's not a good thing. I encourage CEOs of companies, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's insurance, whether it's financial services, to spend an hour a month talking to their head of fraud, and whoever that is. And I say fraud, I'm using it more broadly. Head of identity, head of authentication, head of fraud management. Not asking for the update on their projects, but asking them what keeps them up at night. Mm-hmm. Because it always, the threats and the solutions, and the business cases that are trying to be driven to really, keep people, keep users, keep customers, keep businesses safe online, are not always understood at the highest levels, at the board level and the CEO level. So I think there's a lot of education that needs to be done, and I really think CEOs should spend time with their heads of fraud and their CISOs and their
everyone else.
Yeah, that's right.
So what's happening at UNUM to help close that gap, right? To help respond to that need for digital trust?
Well, we're doing a ton of work around consumer identity right now, right? Insurance is slow to move. We've got 4 or 5 different companies, 4 or 5 different identity solutions. Because they're different brands, the consumer doesn't really see that, right? They think they're logging into Colonial Life, they think they're logging into UNUM, they think they're logging into StarMount, where in the back end it's like 14 different identity systems, and they're all, and so, if you register with one, you have to register with the other and register with the other. So that really that consolidation of consumer identity within UNUM to that single kind of username, password experience, and then you can kind of choose your flow from there, right? Because when you're talking about identity in insurance, it's not just identification, there's also kind of macro authorization that comes with it, right? Because when you're authenticating, and we kind of separate it between the persona and the belly button, right? I physically want to authenticate the belly button, right? But there's a different flow depending on what persona that you're doing, right? So you may be, an HR admin, and you need to come in and administer your company's information, but you also may be a policy holder, and you need to come in and administer your own personal policy. So how do you flip between those, right? I may be a UNUM employee that also functions as an agent, that also functions as a policy holder. So how do I, once I get my entity, once I know that you're you, and then, what's that flow? What does that look like? What's the experience for the user, in the event that they need to go be a different persona? Because, you've also got complications around, well, what's that username and password look like, right? If you're a UNUM employee and you're doing your
work with an @unum.com email address, but you're also a policy holder and you want your policy information sent to at gmail.com, which of those emails do I do to do a password reset? Right? And in what context should I be doing that password reset? They're all extremely complicated challenges that we have that are very unique to our industry because of the way the identities work. Within it, it's very similar in fintech as well. And so we've really been put a lot of time, energy, and effort into getting that into a delightful user experience for our customers. Right?
Well, that's good, and I really like how you talk about that blanket experience where the customer's not really feeling it, right? So it's happening behind the scenes. We don't want the customer to feel it.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I mean, because 95% of our logins, single persona, you should log in, get where you need to be.
right. Where do you go behind the scenes? So I'm going to do a time check. Do we want to pause for questions? And I don't know if we have a moderator in the room that can help us field questions. There we go, Dan, thank you.
Stand up and say your name.
Hello, sorry. Stevie Palmetier with a company called LeafLink. We are a cannabis B2B platform. Curious what kind of differences you're seeing between B2C fraud and B2B fraud, specifically with onboarding, digital onboarding, and KYB.
Yeah, that's real good.
You want to start, Ben, B2B?
Well, we don't see a ton of B2B fraud, just the nature of what we sell. We're supplemental insurance, so we sell generally to the customer. And so we would not onboard B2B without tons of contracting and identity work. I mean, generally, we when we're doing B2B, we kind of let the B handle the identity there, right? I don't want to know, I don't want to know your HR and your payroll. I don't want to have people changing passwords and stuff. So we just do SAML and OAuth, and we trust that you're handing us a properly validated identity and that the person is who they say they are. Now that is not infallible. We have had, I won't say a non-zero number of incidents where B2B credentials were handled improperly, and we had some effect because of it. But ultimately, that's where contracting comes in. If you're going to trust someone else's identity, you write into the contract that we are trusting that identity, and if you hand us a bad identity, that's on you and not on us.
Yep. How about you, Marianne?
Yeah, the B2B space is pretty interesting when it comes to fraud. And, it's definitely, you can't imagine the bad actors in their imagination. I'll give you an example, similar example, but if you think about the marketplaces like Amazon, and they're onboarding businesses to be sellers, and then what happens is you have buyers that are out there and they're saying, wake up one day and say, well, I think I need a new iPhone, and then you go out on the Amazon. Or you go out in the marketplace and you look and say, well, where could I buy? I just want to buy a used iPhone. I want to buy something that I can get at a reasonable price. So you go to the marketplace. You engage with the seller that has been onboarded in a B2B environment, and they collect all your information. You find this iPhone price too good to be true, but it's like, oh, wow, it's there. It's on Amazon's website. Must be legitimate. What happens, they collect all your information, they even give you a shipping number, and then finally, after some time, you're waiting and you're saying, well, I haven't received that iPhone. You find out that you received a fake tracking number. You find out later, you get a phone call and your name's been used on a buy now, pay later website by identity theft, and someone's, bought merchandise, on a buy now, pay later site in your name because all that information was collected by a fake business that was onboarded via Amazon. Wow. So, if you think about the ecosystem and around, the marketplace and around B2B environments, it can be as challenging as, any B2C or any other kind of environment. When the bad actors, they don't lack imagination.
Yeah, and one more comment on that, which is it's kind of tangential to it, but in insurance you have to deal with your 1099 agents, right? And it not necessarily fraudulent, but when it comes to taking that device and that identity and trusting the device for the user, right? It's literally whatever they went to Walmart to go pick up that was $200, right? I don't have and the insurance companies, the regulators would love to tell us that we have complete control over our agents, but then the Department of Labor says they're 1099 contractors and there's only so much you can do with a 1099 contractor. So I have no way of saying, I need to validate that your device is secure, that you're coming from, right? And that's ultimately one of the things that you have to struggle with when you're dealing with like digital consumer identity and even digital agent identity, right? Is how strong is that device? Because if I'm tying the identity to the device and the user to the device, then if that device has been compromised and that device is completely under the control of an attacker and they can do key scraping and things like that and key logging to get all of the credentials they need to impersonate that user, there's really nothing else I can do at that point in time. And that's where you have to get into knowledge-based authentication questions and stuff like that gets really, really, really sticky from a consumer experience perspective.
Yeah, KYC is what yesterday. I know you'll say that that's not even an option anymore, right?
Yeah, I would say, I want to have that T-shirt that says, KY, knowledge-based authentication. No, KYB is dead, knowledge-based. It's just so hard for the customer experience to remember what, your car was back in, 1982.
It's like, did I own an 82 Buick Lucerne at some point? I might have.
And the other thing about KYC, and we talk about this a lot, is sometimes you give them the wrong answer because you've recently moved, but the address that popped up is the one that you lived at previously, and that's the best choice, right? Mm-hmm. So interesting. Any other questions from the audience? No? All right, so let's get in, before we get into closing remarks, I say the future is here. I think 5 years ago, I was actually doing a business case to talk about some of the solutions that exist today, right? You take the selfie, you compare it to the ID. What's the future, right? What's the future of modernizing identity and protection practices look like? And what are some of those solutions that may not be a market today, but we could see in about 5 or 10 years? So I'll start with you, Marianne.
Yeah, I think I think the future in identity is going to be very interesting. If you really look at the discussions that are going on globally, you'll see in some cases, like especially in Scandinavia, where the government's taken this project on, and there's central federated ID, that's used across many different interactions, whether it's applying for a government services or whether it's applying for a bank account or a number of things. In the U.S. market, I don't see the government taking this on as a project, but I do see private sector taking this on, and I think we'll start to see some private sector solutions that come out that'll start to ease some of the identity proofing. It's going to take time. I think we'll see maybe situations where you can onboard, go through those digital identity proofing steps, and then that identity can be held in a central location that can be used across different experiences. So I think that we'll start to see experiences like that will help us navigate between different, I would say even, if we just start to say going from one financial institution to another, or from one healthcare company to another, start to see improvements in many, many ways. Yeah.
What about you, Ben?
Well, I would love to see an open standard, right? An open interoperable standard. One of my side things is I'm one of the founders of Rocky Linux. If anybody's a Linux geek out there, we can talk after. But the problem with a self-signed digital identity has been a problem for forever, right? Like hardly anybody. Every once in a while, y'all get an email that comes through that has that little lock symbol on it, right? That like proves that it actually was that person who sent it. That's been part of the internet for 2 decades, and it might be 1% of the email traffic that we actually know that person's sending it. It's the same problem when we're talking about a consumer's identity. A consumer doesn't know how to handle cryptographic key material correctly. And the only way digitally for me to know that you're you is through cryptographic key material, right? To do it correctly. Now, what has evolved is now that sits on the device, right? Y'all probably heard in the news like Windows 11, it's like your old laptop doesn't work with Windows 11. That's because Windows is forcing, what Apple calls kind of like the trusted enclave, or they're requiring a TPM, a trusted platform module, inside the device. And so once we have pervasive TPM within devices, we can do things like register physically that device, and that device can be two-factored properly with biometrics. I physically know you're there at the point, and I physically know it's you because it's a belly button sort of thing. The problem, and what I hope the industry figures out in the next 3 to 5 years, is that every single person has to do that independently right now. Every single company has to place that certificate on the TPM, or has to challenge the TPM, and has to store that identity locally. And where I think it will happen is that we will eventually have identity brokers the way we have data brokers, and there will be trusted identity brokers. Apple's kind of on the fringe of this right now. Like, they've started to say, hey, we're going to let you store your driver's license in Apple Wallet, right? That came out like 2 weeks ago. And Apple's now saying, we have validated that this driver's license is an actual driver's license and is this person's driver's license with Apple. And I think we'll see more and more of that, and we'll be able to, instead of users controlling their identity, it will be their trusted third parties like Apple's and Google's that they deal with on a daily basis that will become that identity broker. And instead of saying, oh, well, it's a social media login where it's an email and a password, which isn't secure enough for us, it's now, this is an identity that's tied to a driver's license, that's tied to a person, that's tied to, that we know is that actual person. I think that's really probably where we're going in the next 5 or 6 years.
Wow, personal identity as a commodity, right? Like, you have those brokers there for you.
Yep.
So we got about a minute and a half left. Any closing thoughts? What do you want to leave the audience with, Ben?
I don't know. I'm a security guy, so I'll completely deviate from identity. I always close all my conferences with, patch your servers, implement two-factor. Hey, identity, right? Implement two-factor, and try not to make somebody like me angry. And that's the best way to protect you from that sort of stuff.
I like that.
Yeah.
Mary Ann?
I want to say, if any of you here are part of an organization where identity conversations are going on, make sure that it's addressed. Identity is something that if you don't address it up front, you'll have to address it later, and it certainly can hurt customer experiences. It can hurt your business if you don't, and certainly if you do, it can accelerate and enable your business.
Perfect. Well, great timing. We've got 30 seconds left. Right. Mary Ann Miller from Prove, Ben Agner, not Miller, from UNUM. Thank you. We appreciate having you here today.
Thank you. We
Thanks,
appreciate it.
Thanks,
guys.
everyone. Yeah.
That's funny.